Minnesota's good economic news continues, fueled by our continued strong economic growth. Our state's budget surplus for the next biennium has increased from the $1,037 million in last November's forecast to $1,869 million now. That's an increase of $832 million, caused principally by Minnesota's continued economic growth that exceeded economists' projections just 3 months ago. It's important to put this budget surplus in its proper perspective. When I took office in 2011, our state was still in the clutches of the Great Recession and was facing yet another projected budget deficit. The legislature and I dealt with it in 2011 in the same way that the previous governor and legislature had dealt with their previous recessions and deficits. We reduced spending and increased borrowing. Fortunately, Minnesota's economy has turned around, and in fact, our state has led the nation's economic recovery. Our success has produced this surplus. It hasn't come from higher tax rates, as some will claim. Tax rates haven't changed since the last legislative session. This surplus comes from more Minnesotans working than ever before in our state's history, and for more of them earning higher incomes than before. So what should we do with our collective good fortune? Some will say, well, let's give it back to ourselves. Let's spend it ourselves on things that we want and need. That has appeal, for there are certainly things that most of us want and need. However, we have no assurance that this national economic recovery will last indefinitely. History assures us, in fact, that it won't. Inevitably, there will be another national economic slowdown or downturn, and Minnesota's economy will be affected like everyone else's. Our budget surpluses will disappear. So I propose that we invest our collective good fortune in our collective better future, in education and transportation, for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, and for the generations that will follow. Since we may not have the same opportunities in the years ahead, it's even more important that we make those investments now. My January budget proposal focused on those two principal areas, education and transportation. They will remain my focus in my supplemental budget proposal, which I will submit the week of March 9th after Management and Budget has repriced the current spending in light of the new forecast. I will propose to fully fund universal pre-K for all of Minnesota's 4-year-olds, which is partially funded in my current budget. That will cost an additional $238 million in the next biennium. Universal pre-K also frees up additional scholarship money for low-income parents to afford good child care for their children ages 0 to 3. And my child care tax credit will help working parents better to afford those costs for their children. Affordable higher education is also a crucial investment in our better future. The University of Minnesota has said that an additional $65 million will enable them to freeze tuitions for the next 2 years. My present budget proposal would pay for half of it. I'll propose to fund the rest at an additional cost of $32.5 million. In addition to the $30 million I propose to improve the medical school, my proposed additional funding for the university will total $95 million. I will propose the same $95 million of additional funding for MnSCU, which will fully fund a tuition freeze for the first year of the biennium and half the cost of a freeze for the second year. I'll ask them to fund the other half through administrative savings. And I'll propose adding another $25 million to the state grant program to help students and their parents better afford those college educations. My proposed additional increases in higher education funding in my supplement, that's total $152.5 million. A couple of other priorities are to restore funding for the Minneapolis Park Board at its previously budgeted $3.7 million for the biennium, and to set aside $50 million to implement the expected recommendations of my Child Protection Task Force. Those new recommendations total an additional $444.2 million out of the additional surplus of $832 million. I look forward to working with the legislature, who now has the definitive budget for the rest of this legislative session. Look forward to seeing their proposals come forward, both the House and the Senate, and having the opportunity to work collaboratively together to create a still better future for the people of Minnesota. Be glad to respond to questions.
Governor, at your budget release, you said that increasing spending for nursing homes would be high on your new priorities.
It is, and there's still, as I said, there's still almost $400 million that's on reserve here. I don't have the right, what I consider to be the right approach to that, but I do agree that there'll be additional funding necessary, and I think the legislature is looking at a couple of options for that now.
Governor, what's your view of the calls for increased local government aid?
Well, I put increased local government aid into the transportation proposal. The counties get, and cities and townships get 28 cents out of every dollar, so there's over $2 billion of additional local government aid for over the next decade from my proposal, and I think it'd be more productive to target that additional money on roads and bridges, and they have those needs certainly. But the counties in particular get an enormous amount of additional money, cities as well, but especially the counties. And that's the approach I would prefer to take.
Governor, why is it not proper, in your view, to give the money back, to offer tax cuts, rebates, some sort of payback to the Minnesota taxpayers who made this surplus happen?
Well, I mean, as I said, that's an appealing option, because there are certainly things that people want to spend additional money in their pockets on. And I have proposed a child care tax credit, so that's part of my previous budget proposal. I'm just saying that, look back historically, that was done in 1999, again in 2000 by the legislature and Governor Ventura. There were a string of budget surpluses then, and people were comfortable that those were going to continue, so they cut taxes permanently in those two budget legislative sessions, and then very soon thereafter, the economy leveled off, and then went into the Great Recession, and they were looking at serious deficits for the next several years. So I'd rather avoid that possibility in the future, and probability somewhere in the future that we're going to go through another economic downturn. And if we cut back on permanently on the resources that are available, I expect either I or future governors and future legislatures will have to resort to some of the same strategies that did not prove constructive for the state of Minnesota, for education, and for the things that I'm proposing we deal with here. So, I'd rather see us invest the money from our collective good fortune in a collective better future for all of us and for our kids and grandkids. And I think the investments I've targeted here are in line with that priority for universal pre-K and for higher education affordability. And that's what those are the ingredients that have made Minnesota successful, and more successful than most other states. And we have an additional challenge now with a diverse population to close the achievement gap and bring all of our children, our future adults, future taxpayers, up to a level of educational proficiency as we have before. And if we fall short of that, our economic future is going to fall short of what it should be and what it needs to be for the benefit of all of us. So I'd rather see us make investments in education that are going to pay off for Minnesota for years to come, transportation that are going to pay off for Minnesota for years to come, and lay the foundation for a better economic future and social vitality in years ahead.
Governor, would you characterize your viewpoint as more of a long-term approach than a short-term approach?
That's a good way to put it, yes.
Governor,
Thank you. I'll use that. Thank you.
How about a one-time check instead of permanent tax cuts?
That's been done before. It could be done. I mean, the legislature, I'm open to discussing with the legislature their views of the best uses of this money. It's the highest budget surplus, I'm told, in the state's history in dollar amount. So, there are going to be other good ideas through the legislative process and how to best allocate it. But again, I think we're better off to make investments for the future, to take a long-term approach rather than a short-term approach.
Governor, you transportation several times. Does this alleviate the need for new revenues for transportation? Are you going to be willing to use some of the general fund money for transportation, or are you going to have the same fight that you predicted in January?
Well, I continue to believe that a dedicated revenues stream for transportation is essential to correct the deficiencies that have developed all over the state and to provide the base of funding for the next decade. You know, one-time additional money out of the general fund, out of what turned out to be a one-time general fund surplus was tried before, and it just gives a little boost to funding for that one construction season. But the highway builders tell me that doesn't really change. You know, they don't, without an assured source of funding, and an assured amount of funding in the years ahead, they're not going to make the capital investments in new and additional equipment for road construction. They're not going to hire the additional people to take on those additional projects. So it's an inefficient way to try to, you know, restore some of the deficiencies, and it's a 1 year, one construction season deal. We need something that if it ends up being part of a long-term package that does not rely on general fund surpluses to fund the transportation improvements we need to be making every year for the next decade, then, you know, I certainly look at it. But it's got to be part of a long-term transportation solution.
Politically, doesn't it become nearly impossible to raise any new revenue given that we have a nearly $2 billion surplus?
Well, as I said, you know, you can use some part of that, transfer from general fund uses for transportation purposes, but it needs, in my opinion, that would need to be paired with again, a long-term funding source. My proposal is for 10 years. The construction industry would say that they need that assurance of a reliable stream of revenues at a certain level to make the investments that they need to expand their capability to undertake these additional projects. So, you know, one biennium out of the general fund with no assurance of anything to continue thereafter is not a solution to our problems. And I will object to anybody portraying it as a solution to the problem. If it wants to be part of this long-term solution, then we can certainly talk about that. But I don't want anybody here fooling themselves or fooling the people of Minnesota that you know, a one-time, one-shot deal is going to resolve anything.
Governor, you're restoring funding to the Parks and Rec Board and MnSCU. Does that signal that you're satisfied that they've resolved some of the issues you identified before in restoring the funding?
Well, I'm told the Park Board and the Chair of the Met Council are going to have an announcement today that made some very significant progress, really a breakthrough. And I give great credit to the new Met Council Chair, Adam Dunnock, who really engaged with the Park Board. I give credit to the Park Board members. And this is a very, very significant move ahead for the Southwest Light Rail line. And so on that basis, I'm restoring the $3.7 million that I took out of their base budget for the next biennium. And MnSCU is in process. I'm going on still a bit of a faith that their discussions are going to lead to better rapport and better ability of everybody involved to move cooperatively and constructively ahead together. And if that doesn't occur over the next few months, the legislature will have an opportunity to assess that progress and make its own determinations. But you know, I want the tuition freezes have been very important for both the university and for the MnSCU program for the last 2 years, and the ability to continue them for the next 2 years is a significant incentive for me to be willing to take a leap of faith with them.
Anything else?
Governor, you predicted your critics saying that this came from tax increases. Specifically, they say you raise taxes by $2 billion, you have a $2 billion surplus. Did you need to raise taxes after all, now looking back?
Oh, we needed to raise taxes at the time to pay off the school debt and to deal with the projected deficit that we faced 2 years ago. And fortunately, our economic recovery has been strong. It surpassed expectations then. Every time we increase the surplus or reduce the deficit over the last 4 years, it's because of the improvement in our economy. It's also about the improvement that has gone above and beyond the experts' predictions in the last forecast. So $832 million more in the surplus from 3 months ago is really an exceptionally strong performance. And it's certainly not from any changes in tax code, and is from slightly less spending because of fewer people in poverty for education purposes, which is great news as well. I mean, we're a long way out of having kids in poverty, but at least that's improving. So, you know, it doesn't hold water to say that this is because of a tax increase. Going from in 2012, beginning of 2013, that projected budget deficit of $623 million for the upcoming biennium, and the $2.7 billion that we owed the school districts at that point in time, that revenue increase, I think I've seen about 2 zillion ads that said it was $2.1 billion. I'll take it as a word, but you know, 1.5 billion of that came from the top 2%. That money went to square our fiscal account, and now we're not looking at deficits anymore. We have a surplus, which again, I would maintain if you look at the forecast of a year ago, and the fact that we actually cut income taxes in the last session and provided property tax relief. So, but from the forecast of a year ago to today, the surplus has, you know, grown considerably. Most of that increase, 1.89 billion. So it's good news for Minnesota. Minnesotans produced it, and now the question is, how are we going to apply that to a better Minnesota?
Governor, and the other prediction about the exodus of business, corporate income's down a bit, but individual income is up. So what are we to make of that?
Well, you know, you can find anecdotal evidence of businesses moving. You can find, I would say, even more anecdotal evidence of businesses that are locating or expanding in Minnesota. And our economy is thriving. We've got a 3.6% unemployment rate. If businesses were closing shop and leaving in any number, the unemployment would be going in the other direction. And you know, we've got a long ways to go with our economy, get back to where we want to be and should be, and to give everybody a chance to find a good, well-paying job, which is why, again, the education piece is so important, because we need to educate our young people, and we need to train them with the skills that are going to be necessary for the better paying jobs in the years ahead. We have a labor shortage right now in Minnesota, places all over the state who cannot find particularly skilled workers in areas like engineering and construction and computer science and the like. So we need to, you know, be retooling our education system so we bring all of our kids into a successful, productive adulthood, and also in jobs that are going to pay them well. And that's going to be the key to our economic future.
Tradition dictates that Republicans are resistant to any spending increases, and with them holding the majority in the House, and somewhat your controversy with Senator Bach, what will you do to move the Republicans your way? And do you feel that this situation, in light of the fact that our neighboring state of Wisconsin is applying previous tax policies that we've seen here, and they're experiencing a deficit compared to our surplus, is there anything you can say about that?
Well, I think our economic success speaks for itself. You know, we're not competing with Wisconsin or any other individual state. I want Wisconsin to do well. I want Minnesota to do better. And I think we are doing better, and I'm pleased with that. And again, I would go back to, I think, the fundamentals of our economic success for decades, and what we've applied here has been an investment in our people, and the well-educated, hardworking, productive workforce, and the you know, we have a difference of philosophies, and the, you know, Republican majority in the House gave them, by the voters of Minnesota, the authority to press for their priorities, and I was reelected, so I have the authority to press for mine, and the Senate's still here. So, you know, we have that balance, and we're going to have to work out an agreement by the end of the session that I expect will incorporate different points of view. And I've always said compromise means you agree to something you don't agree with. and I expect to have to compromise. I expect the legislators will have to compromise if we're going to reach a solution. So, you know, that's still out there to be formulated, but I'm hopeful that we'll do that successfully, and I've had a good relationship with Speaker Doubt, and I appreciate his candor, and I appreciate his constructive involvement in resolving the deficiency bill, and I've had a good relationship with Senator Bach for decades, and we're both grown-ups, and we both are used to moving beyond a temporary blip, and we have, and we will continue to work to get together, and ultimately we all are accountable for serving the people of Minnesota. We might have different views of what that best entails, but ultimately we're all here for the same reason, to make this a better state. I see the speaker is now here with his arms folded, so he can elaborate on that as I leave shortly.
Do you think that this, the size of this surplus ultimately makes it easier to reach a budget agreement, or gives you more room to quibble over how to spend it?
Well, that's a good point. I think I'd certainly rather deal with a surplus than a deficit. I remember back in 2011 cutting, over $2 billion in spending, and then dealing with the borrowing that was necessary. I mean, that was a very unpleasant task, necessary. So I'd much prefer the surplus. But there are a lot of groups out there, a lot of people. We don't take this revenue and sit on it, inflating government for its own sake. This money goes out the door through services to people, through direct payments to people, so paying for people's health care, paying for people's education, paying for the roads and bridges improvements. I mean, this revenue enables us to do things for Minnesota, do things that we can't do individually, unless you want to go out and build your own highway. I mean, it's just not feasible. So this is about what we put together collectively, not for government, this sort of this evil alien force out there in the stratosphere. This is about we the people. Tax money is money we take from everybody to pool to do things we couldn't do by ourselves that are going to benefit our entire state. And again, I go back to the years I've been involved here, which has gotten to be a long time now, under Republican, Democratic governors and, not presidents too, but governors, independent governor, legislators, Republican, Democrat. We have followed a model that has worked for Minnesota, and we ought to give ourselves credit for that. The people of Minnesota deserve the credit for that. The businesses of Minnesota deserve the credit for that. The policymakers of Minnesota deserve the credit for a much more balanced approach than a lot of other states who thought they just cut taxes and eliminate any environmental protections and just raise it to the bottom. That's going to boost them ahead. And the opposite has occurred. They've fallen, relatively speaking, farther behind. We've done well because we've been smart and invested well in our people, and our people have been great. They've responded. The business people have been great. They've responded, and we're enjoying the results of that now. I would urge that we don't just discard the lessons that we should have learned from that experience and proceed apace to do even better. Okay?
You're set for $850 million bonding proposal. Is that
that's what I'm looking for doing, and I have now in this proposal the additional cash to pay for the additional debt service for the next period of time. So that'll be forthcoming probably the second half of March.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you.